Good morning, everyone. So we are going to start. Hi, everyone. So my name is Lesego Moshikaro-Amani, and I am from TIPS, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's very important development dialogue that looks at the future of South Africa's steel industry. So the discussions today will explore options for revitalizing the steel value chain and also look at policy considerations that will take the steel industry forward. So we know that locally as well as globally, the steel industry is very important for economies, particularly as it's regarded as the backbone for manufacturing, for construction, for infrastructure, as well as for transportation. And now, as we talk about transitioning to low carbon economy and to a green economy, we know that steel, particularly green steel, plays a very important role in supporting this transition. And now, when we look at locally, and the whole purpose of this dialogue, it's really to seek to explore potential pathways and solutions to rescue South Africa's steel industry, which remains a key pillar in advancing South Africa's industrial policy and also our industrialization goals and objectives. But however, we know that currently the industry is facing several challenges, and with the most immediate crisis being seen in long steel production. So last year, there were news and talks about the potential closure of long steel plants in Newcastle and also in Vereeniging. But we've also seen intervention that has come about because we know that these closures could actually lead to high unemployment, and it could also undermine South Africa's manufacturing sector. Also, there has been pressure points which have pushed the South African steel industry into a deep crisis. And these include, for example, cheap imports. It includes stagnant domestic demand, rising operational costs, including the high cost of electricity in South Africa. And also it includes external trade barriers. And yesterday, the USA announced a 50% tariff on steel imports, which leads to further uncertainties to the steel industry. We also have China's economic slowdown, which has added further strain to the steel industry and also to the global market. These factors have eroded the South African competitiveness of the steel industry, but also globally. And so in this context, I think some questions arise of whether the domestic steel industry is able to compete in this changing global environment? And if not, what are some of the strategic decisions and difficult trade-offs that need to be made in South Africa when we're considering saving this industry and expanding it and also looking at ways to grow it? I know Neva's presentation will touch on some of these trade-offs that need to be made. So in terms of the format of today's development dialogue, we have three presenters, starting with a presentation by Neva. And so they'll take us through various issues and also provide recommendations on the direction of the steel industry. So what we'll do is we'll take all three speakers, and then after that, we'll leave some time at the end for Q&As. So today we have quite a bit of time for questions and answers and also any additional inputs. So if you have any questions throughout the presentations, please note that until the end, and then we'll take them at the end after the third presenter. So as I mentioned, we do have quite some time for questions and answers. So hopefully that will allow us to have a meaningful and engaging discussion on the topic. So our first presenter today is going to be Dr. Neva Makgetla, who is a Senior Economist at TIPS. And Neva has written quite extensively on the topic of steel. And today she will be taking us through a presentation which looks at exploring options for the steel industry. Neva also recently published a paper which is on the TIPS website, and it's titled Options for Localizing Steel Inputs for the Infrastructure Build Program. So if you are interested in that paper after the presentation, please have a look at the TIPS website. Neva, over to you. You have 15 minutes to present your slides.
And just to be clear, we will circulate the slides. Okay, so what we put in the proposal for the development, the description of the dialogue was that really the core of this problem in many ways is that AMSA's prices have increased, unit costs have increased significantly in the recent past, well, over the past 20 years, really in the long run, but specifically you have this price bump there where after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of input prices went up very quickly at the same time as the unit cost is also high, because what you can also see from that orange line going down is you also had a decline in production during COVID, and you haven't seen that much recovery, and overheads, of course, tend to stay high, particularly with very large mills. So the unit cost also went up because of that. And you can see the other operating costs jumped at that point. But that dark blue is the input cost, which is mostly coking coal, followed by iron ore. And those prices went way up with the surge in international prices. And so what's the challenge? We would argue that the historic, the crude steel production in South Africa was competitive historically because we have high quality, cheap iron ore, and ISCOR owned the iron mines. And so now there's Columbus Steel, so does Sasol. Where you own the iron mines, you can sort out the pricing internally. You're not affected. You get the full rents compared to the international price. Also, the state provided cheap electricity and dedicated rail services, particularly for Newcastle, which is kind of a bit remote. So that also helped hold down the cost of production. There was, of course, very large long-term investments by government from the 1920s in various forms because it was a state-owned company. It was ISCOR. But often, it was designed for this industrial policy that was geared toward industrialization to maintain European standards for a minority, as well as economic growth. So the majority didn't see that much benefits from it. And the one thing I would say in terms of what you said, Lesego, the thing about iron ore and steel is it's become less important in modern economies over time. And I think we tend to assume that somehow it still plays the same role it played in the 20s and 30s. I mean, I have this thing, our industrial policy tends to be either Fordist or Stalinist, but not very modern in either case. No? Yeah, and then at the same time, domestic demand was rising and there was limited competition from local and foreign producers, partially because the logistics were more expensive, partially because of the way the international steel industry was structured. And we were competitive on export markets. So we were able to export quite a lot, especially to Europe, yeah? And then later on to Asia. What's happened since then? Well, basically since 94, gradually over time, basically to be blunt, ISCOR became AMSA and gave up the mines. And so then they had to start paying Kumba and then now subsequently other smaller mines for a price that is now below import parity, but linked to import prices, as I understand it, subject to correction. Not at all. Okay. But the fact is, you can see that the iron ore price went up when the international price went up. So maybe you can explain that because maybe I'm missing that. So you had this extreme spike in coal and iron ore prices in 2022 and 2023 that helped push up prices there. They are lower now, but they're still higher than they were 10 or 15 years ago in constant man terms. We obviously have all of us seen higher cost and less reliable electricity. We're just coming out with our quarterly economic review, and what we looked at the electricity prices again because they're going up by another 12% nominal, which is 10% real. They've gone up by 250% since 2008, above inflation. That is in real terms. That squeezes everybody. Then you had load shedding, which adds to the cost. Then you had the problems with Transnet, which particularly for Newcastle makes it harder to get their stuff to the consumers, whether it's inland or at the coast. The historic integrated mills now owned by AMSA, we've seen falling capital expenditure and falling asset values. AMSA's share in domestic private capital expenditure dropped from 0.7% in 2000, on an average from 2000 to 2008 to 0.2% from 2018 to 2023. Part of that is the declining importance of steel in the economy overall. Part of that is an actual decline in the value of CapEx in constant man terms. And it's very hard for government to say we're going to make up that difference because it's very hard to show that this kind of, production which creates relatively few jobs will benefit people. And we should take money, if it's from the budget, should we take money from education and health or social grants? If it's the IDC, should we take money from other industries in effect? So those trade-offs have become much tougher when we're not only trying to benefit a minority. Again, the historic mills have seen a falling domestic market share, partially because, there's been declining steel intensity of growth. I mean, domestic demand is now at, a year or two ago was at 1976 levels. So what you have is a zero-sum game. And in that context, you have the emergence of the mini mills and in long steel and imports of flat steel going up as well from China. And there's the potential for this, the Chinese keep saying they're going to build these new plants in Zimbabwe. They've started with long steel. They say they're going to do flat steel. They own the mines, or they have access to cheap iron ore from the mines. They have access to cheap coking coal. So they will likely be very competitive with our producers. And obviously under the AFCFTA, it's much harder to impose tariffs on neighboring countries. No? Even if we should do it. Even if we wanted to, it's hard. And then the COVID-19 downturn had weak recovery and fiscal constraints, making it harder to get infrastructure investment going. So infrastructure investment by government is now about a third lower than it was in the mid-2010s. I mean, it started falling before COVID. I know we say we'll get it back up. It's going to be incredibly hard because COVID, we went way into debt for COVID, and recovering from that puts fiscal constraints on everything. And in terms of export markets, first you had the expansion of the EU, and then you had the China joining the WTO, and both of those things brought massively increased imports from other cheap sources of steel, particularly into the European market, but also internationally. And then, of course, there are the US tariffs, which will only make dumping worse everywhere. So, just some numbers. Saul said we need more numbers. So that blue line is locally produced steel sold locally. And what you can see is it's been going down since 2005 after climbing quite rapidly. The light blue is import, so it also grew, but it's not that dominant. But the place you've also really seen a crash, particularly since COVID, is on exports of steel. And what this doesn't show is there was also a shift from AMSA to mini mills in terms of exports. No? So to that particular kind of long steel. But what it means is that you can see there's been a steady decline in total steel consumption in South Africa, as well as exports. And that puts a squeeze on all the steel producers. And you can see this also in terms of the steel intensity of the GDP. That dark line is I don't know why it says percentages, but it's basically showing the amount of steel used per unit of GDP produced. And it's come down very sharply in South Africa, more sharply than in the rest of the world, particularly in 2008. And we really need to study that. But we know that the global financial crisis particularly hit heavy industry in South Africa, which is why Gauteng got hit particularly. But generally, it's been going down internationally. And that's because we now have things like plastics and other kinds of alternatives for steel. Plus, everybody's trying to make things lighter and easier, and you've got digital controls and so on. All of these things reduce the demand for steel. And that's structural, and that's international. Where you've seen rising steel intensity is places that are growing from low-income to higher-income countries like China and India, where you're getting basic infrastructure in place. But overall, the overall impact has been declining steel intensity of growth. And if we look at just to be clear about the price spike, you can see this is the export parity price in constant band. It's an index for iron ore, coal, and basic steel. And what you can see is you had this extraordinary spike in prices in 2002, 2003. Since come down, iron ore is still quite high by historical standards. Coal has basically been inching up steadily in the last couple of years. We thought it was going down before COVID, but since then it's gone up. It will likely come down. But because of the shift away from coal. But right now it's not coming down. And the steel price also went up, but not nearly as much. And so that obviously I would argue the last couple of years, have inevitably put a squeeze on steel producers. Because your costs are going up, but you can't really push your prices up that much because of the competitive markets. Okay, and then if you look at the impact in terms of AMSA, this dark blue is AMSA's local sales. Again, as we showed before, they've come down rapidly, particularly with COVID. Imports, like we said, have been reasonably steady, but domestic production, particularly by this red is basically the mini mills. No? And basically their market share has gone up to 50%. Has gone up significantly, particularly for long steel. They don't produce flat steel very much. I mean, insignificant amounts at this point. And the result has been that AMSA's capacity utilization went from 70% at the start of the century to about 50% now. Well, 60% in flat, 50% in longs, but they also have been writing off assets, which makes the capacity utilization look higher. Yeah? And they've also, this is just profitability. What you can see is they made losses in 7 of the past 12 years. So they're clearly under pressure. And if you look at what this has done to the value of assets, and remember, everybody here, their parents paid for these assets originally when it was ISCOR. The value of fixed assets, which is this light blue, has gone down very substantially, from like 20 billion to about 7 billion. Other assets have been more stable. Never quite know what those are, because sometimes it's things like goodwill, which is fairly intangible. But the other thing is that the market capitalization is done even worse, as we all know. It's now about under 2 billion, which is having been, right at the time it was sold, it was like 20, 30 billion. And if you look at the right axis, this other line is capital expenditure, and it has bounced around a bit, but generally it's been going down. Yeah? That's not the only reason for the decline in the value of assets, but clearly it doesn't help. Yeah? And it does suggest that if we want to improve productivity, there has to be bigger investment, and somebody will have to pay. So your parents paid, and now you can pay. Okay, so what are our policy aims? And I would argue there are weak justifications for the policy for government to step in, and there are strong justifications. And we work mostly in terms of policy. We're not talking about individual companies, except to the extent it affects, constituencies that are important for society. Yeah? So the weak justifications are we should support crude steel because steel is important for the economy in some magical way. Yeah? It's like auto, by the way. None of these things have the same multipliers they used to have. And I think we need to understand that better. But and I'll show the data later, but they are really relatively limited in terms of their contribution to employment, the GDP, and exports as just crude steel by itself. Yeah? There's also the argument that we could export more, but honestly, outside of DRI and green steel, that is less carbon intensive steel, it's hard to see how we're going to increase exports. And I think people were thinking magically somehow the AFCFTA will expand steel exports, but when you look at total steel imports, they're just not growing. So we would have to outcompete existing exporters to the rest of Africa. And that again requires that we cut costs. So it's not something you can just do. It would require very basic changes internally, not just the AFCFTA. A stronger justification is that we need to support downstream producers, and that having cheap steel was always part of South Africa's international comparative advantage. What made our steel-based producers competitive was that we had cheap quality steel because we had cheap quality inputs, kind of thing. Steel-based manufacturing is 2.4% of national employment. That's a couple 100,000 jobs. This is including auto and machinery. It's 3.4% of the GDP and 22% of exports. Almost all those exports are machinery and auto. Yeah? And there are technological spillovers. So it is a relatively advanced industry, a lot of those downstream industries, and theoretically, we should be building a technological base using these industries. Also critical for public infrastructure, that if we could get cheap quality steel for public infrastructure, that's also good for society. And then there's other construction generally. Yeah? Agriculture uses a bunch of fencing and things and pipes. Okay, so if we look at formal employment in the value chain, this dark line, that's just crude steel. And you can see it's relatively small compared to the rest of the value chain. No? The mines are actually much bigger as employers, but a lot of that is for export. No? Yeah, and you get a similar picture in terms of contribution to GDP. Crude steel is more important relative to GDP, but it's still small relative to the rest of the value chain. And so what we've been saying is that solving for downstream comes from a colleague in government. that we need to solve this problem for the downstream rather than solving it for crude steel. So there may well be benefits for some crude steel producers, but that's not the core aim. The core aim is to ensure that we get quality, low-price steel for the downstream. So the criteria for success would be that we have lower cost steel inputs, so but that means you can't just rely on tariffs and designations. You can't rely on protecting local producers from imports. You have to say, how do we bring down their costs so they become competitive? We need to ensure there's access to special grades of steel, particularly for manufacturing and for auto and machinery, where the original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, insist on certifying inputs themselves, and they insist on certifying the quality of the steel themselves. No? And that requires special kinds of equipment and investment. You can't just do that in any old mill. One of the big advantages of local production that adds to the lower cost is you have more responsive supply chains. So how do you ensure that it's not just lower price, but it also responds to the needs of the consumer in a more coordinated way? And the critical steps are then, how do we reduce the price of steel for the downstream, manufacturing, public infrastructure, others, so that people are not just saying whatever cost savings we make as crude steel producers, we don't pass them on to the downstream. And that's been a concern for a long time. You may remember in the 2010s, there was an argument, and there's an argument now even about the mini mills, that people will export and get the export parity price rather than supplying downstream at the cost plus price, so that they keep the rents. Yeah? So you have to move the rents downstream, and that means from the mines in terms of raw materials and other inputs, iron ore, energy, freight transport being the main ones. But energy includes coking coal, and how we manage coking coal is, I think, something we haven't talked about enough. There's complicated issues around coking coal. It's not so simple as just the rents. It's also about how we manage the processing. But also then the crude steel prices, if we get those input prices down, how do we ensure they're actually passed on to manufacturers? And then also, how do we ensure domestic production of special steels in the long run? Some options you might have a transition from Newcastle, which is where they are made currently. But how do you manage that transition then? But don't just say in the long run, we want to just import them. I don't think that anybody would see that as acceptable if it's avoidable. But if we had a flat choice between high cost long steel for everybody to sustain special steels and importing special steels, we maybe should say import the special steels. These are the tough choices. Yeah? Like trade, we always talk about trade-offs, we never say what the trade-offs are. Okay, so some of the policy dimensions we would have to think about to come up with a strategy and response. Firstly, which producers and sites can best meet objectives? And I'm speaking now from the government perspective, not from the perspective of stakeholders or the industry. Because at some point, as we all know, government has to make some decisions. So in long steel, look, we already have a dynamic and competitive market structure in long steel. But we have significant overcapacity as a result, because the mini mills are basically outcompeting Newcastle on basic long steel, but they don't produce the special steels. So the question is, how do we come up with a production structure that meets our needs for some special steels without just pushing up the price of long steel to everybody, so that we're effectively subsidizing the special steels in order to maintain economies of scale at Newcastle? That's really what the problem is there. And we need to say, in the long run, what is the aim of the country, and then how do we manage this transition? The second thing is, in flat steel, look, we have one big producer, which is AMSA. It has monopoly power, and that leads to higher prices, but also other things like, lobbying for tariffs and so on. And how do we manage that relationship to get an optimal outcome for the country? Yeah? We are not good at dealing with lobbying, I would say. And in effect, what we're really talking about here is something that, Halbrona calls creative destruction. Sorry, Schumpeter calls, well, these Germans, calls creative destruction, which is to say, we have new technologies and producers coming up. The older existing established producers can't keep up. That's a very difficult transition to manage. And the temptation is always to say, sustain the established proven producer and just sort of stop the competition, but experience shows it doesn't work. No? And the other thing about creative destruction is, that the established producers also usually better at lobbying. They have the relationships, they're bigger, they're able to throw their power, the existing power around. And that's something government also has to think about, how we manage any case of creative destruction. The same thing is with the green transition. Okay, the second thing is we need measures to reduce costs, and that is obviously the core substantive issue. That if we don't reduce costs across the industry and make sure those rents go to the downstream, we can't achieve the national aims we set ourselves. So that means raw materials, like I said, iron ore, coking coal, also scrap. We're doing it with scrap to some extent. But the issue is, how do we extend those kinds of measures to the rest of the industry? Electricity and transport, which are less critical for the mini mills. And I think that's part of the problem, because they tend to be in cities nearer to their main customers and the ports, right? Whereas Newcastle was set up before that became a critical issue. But the other issue is, easy to say cut the costs. Eskom and Transnet have their own problems. And forcing them to take a price cut is probably at this point almost impossible, just to be clear. No? But we might come up with other solutions. Technology upgrades are critical, and we kind of estimate the cost is probably at least 15 billion rand to get a competitive industry, and there is no money in the budget. And to be clear, the DTIC's entire budget for incentives is around 10 billion. Yeah? And the IDC's total assets are now what, 15 or 20 billion max? I think more like 15. Less.
Disbursements, assets are about 100 and something.
Yeah, okay, so I don't mean assets, I mean disbursements. But I mean, it would be equal to their total disbursements in a year. So this is serious money we're talking about if we want to upgrade these mills. But if we're not going to cut costs, I don't think we can justify, you can justify things like designations and transitions as a transitional measure to support an infant industry. But if it's never going to become competitive, that's very hard to do. Third issue is around special steels. There is a trade-off between holding down the cost of long steel to all producers and maintaining competitive long steel production through the mini mills and maintaining special steels production. Maintaining special steels production, which is currently in Newcastle, which would require significant upgrades on the part of the mini mills. And some of them will never get there, but there are a couple that might be able to do it, but they would need big investment. Even Vereeniging, which is the AMSA plant that could do it, would require investment. And there's also the issues of the transition. They need to get certification from the foreign brands. And the APDP, you'd probably have to have some kind of deeming mechanism to manage a transition if Newcastle closed down. Yeah? And if you shift production elsewhere. And then finally, of course, the fun question, who's going to pay? Ideally, we would get private investors. Practically, probably it's a very long-term investment. Steel is generally not super profitable in this world. So unless we can find a way to hold down the input costs and make it highly competitive, like what they've done in Zimbabwe, then government ends up picking up at least part of the tab. Yeah? But how much will the public be willing to pay for this, given the squeeze on every other service? Given that basically the budget's not growing, and that's what we got by getting rid of VAT. It's going to be really hard to justify massive investments in steel unless we can show that the benefits will in fact be there for voters in terms of jobs and so on. Sorry, one more slide. I have no idea how much time it is, sorry. And so there are some hard trade-offs. The first one, like we said, is downstream versus upstream. Government would have to say, we're going to require the upstream to shift the rents, at least some of the rents, to downstream. I mean, just to be clear, only 10% of our total iron ore production is produced locally. But, some of these other things like electricity, it's a lot tougher. Yeah? And for the steel mills, obviously, they want to, if they get the rents from upstream, they would rather hang on to it. Yeah? Second problem is, how do we, like I said, we don't want to disrupt special steels, but we also don't want to have an uncompetitive steel industry overall. So we can't do what we've effectively been doing, which is say, we'll protect long steel production at Newcastle so they can get to the economies of scale where they can produce the special steels. Unless we can find a way to cut costs at Newcastle. And I have to say, virtually nobody I've talked to sees that as possible, but I'm open to correction. Yeah? And there is overcapacity in long steel. So we are making a choice. And to be clear, about 1,500 people employed permanently at Newcastle and about 8,000 people employed in the mini mills. So somebody's going to lose out also in terms of jobs. Now, unless we could get demand up. But as I've said, I think, demand, you can inch it up a bit, but it's not going to solve 30% overcapacity in long steel. Yeah. And again, managing creative destruction requires political will, because you have to say we have to make choices between emerging producers and established producers. And oh God, politicians don't love making choices like that. Yeah? And their officials don't always either. And then there's the issue of Zimbabwe. Do we want regional development? If we want regional development, some kinds of production may end up shifting there, particularly if there's slow growth across the region. Are we actually just going to say, nope, we want to keep them out? How do we think about that? Now, I mean, this is a particularly acute case, but it comes up all the time also with clothing, as you know, sugar, all of these things. And then finally, how do we justify fiscal support for steel, whether it's through the IDC or the budget, given that we have all these other pressing national needs? So yeah, enjoy. Are we all glad we're not in the government anymore?
Thank you very much, Neva, for your presentation and for highlighting those insightful policy options. So our next speaker is online. We have Oren Kaplan, who is the chair of Cape Gate, and he will talk to us about insights from the industry. Hi, Oren. I'll give you 15 minutes. I hope that's enough for your input. Thank you.
Thank you, Lesego. I've always been told that not everybody can make a good presentation like Neva, but everyone can make a short presentation. So it's a pity, first of all, that I'm not in the room with you. It's a little bit difficult to talk to the screen, but I'm going to do my best. Firstly, let me say thank you very much to TIPS, to Neva, who extended the invitation, to everyone involved, Lesego for chairing. There's often been a sense from the industry that policy space and operating space are very far apart. And certainly part of that is our responsibility. So it's a real pleasure and really important, I feel, to be here today and to talk to you. And I'm grateful for the opportunity. And I'm grateful to all of you for listening. I'm certainly going to listen, and I'm going to give you my few cents worth as well. My brief, I think, was to try and give an industry perspective. I'm going to do as much as that I can. A brief introduction just to myself. As this is it's an academic environment as far as I'm concerned, from what I've read and heard from Neva. I studied at the University of Cape Town. I got an honours degree in finance. And then unusually, I pursued my graduate studies in social anthropology in different parts of the world before joining Cape Gate. And at Cape Gate, Cape Gate is a 95-year-old business, started in 1929 in a place called Parow in Cape Town, and has grown into one of now the more important steel producers. We started to produce steel. We were the only non-government allied steel mill in 1980 when we started. People thought that we were, I think crazy was the word, to try and go up against a government institution. We've done that, and we remain one of the only steel mills in South Africa where there's no government interest, either directly or indirectly. So whether there's no direct shareholding through the IDC or something else, that's ours, and I'm aware of at least one other. So I joined Cape Gate and have done held various positions there over the years, and started to be in charge and run the business from 2009, 2010. We make long product. We are a mini mill, not an induction furnace mill. We are an electric arc furnace mill. We have a capacity of, say, 600,000 tons. We regularly sell between 400 and 500,000 tons a year. And we are focused in the low carbon, easier to make steel, mostly reinforcing bar and wire rod. We have developed, by being vertically integrated, backward vertical integration. So the business started as a small fencing manufacturing business, and then vertically integrated into producing wire for fencing, and then wire rod for making wire, and then back into melting to make wire rod. And at some point as well, we had a joint venture in the scrap business. So we were vertically integrated throughout the value chain. Neva said a lot, and I hope in the discussions that follow, we can dig into some of the details. But I think for now, I just want to focus on big picture issues. The first one is to give you a bit of a flavor of what it's like to run a steel mill right now. We just had our June board meetings looking at the budget period till the end of December. And we're in one of those really difficult stages which we go through. We have a decreasing selling prices, possibly because of the bailout of AMSA. We have increasing prices for scrap metal because right now, at this moment, there's a shortage of scrap metal. And we have double-digit increases in our important operating costs like electricity and water. So it's a triple whammy, one could say. And of course, what makes it incredibly difficult, and it's just characterized what it's been like to run a steel mill for the past 15 years, I'd say, is that we cannot budget for any top-level volume growth. There's no growth which can mitigate our unit cost position. And that's been the situation for longer than I can remember. When we sit down to try and do long-term planning, we have at least for 10 years had the same conversation. The conversation has been, when we look at our business, we need to find a certain amount of growth in tonnage to mitigate these cost increases and to put us onto a sustainable basis going forward. And it's been an almost impossible task. It hasn't been beyond because not of effort or creativity or knowledge or will or capital. There simply hasn't been anywhere to turn to eke out additional growth. And for that reason, we started a method of management in our business called a cost watch. And what we've done very, very religiously is we've tried to manage our unit cost usage down. In other words, if energy, you've got to get less energy usage. If there's no top line growth, we've got no other choice to go into some creative and important cost reduction efforts. And that goes throughout the business. It unfortunately also goes to labor. It goes to energy usage. It goes to a number of every single input you can imagine. And that's the way we've been running the business. And I say all this because the key big picture challenge, which is, to my mind, backgrounded in Neva's remarks, she's recognized it 100%. It's there, but it's backgrounded to my mind. And that is that there's no growth. There's just no growth. And we need to address the matter of growth very, very, very urgently. And if we can't, which we can't do it overnight, then we need to have policy and actions that recognize that we're in a no-growth situation. We're in a no-growth environment. And that's going to have an impact on decisions we make. So if we're going to save capacity, for example, we need to understand we're saving capacity which is already inefficient, and it's in a no-growth environment. And that's going to have a whole lot of implications, as you know. So the key challenge is the first slide that Neva put up. It's the increase in unit costs. You saw it in AMSA, you'd see it in any steel mill, but it's combined with the inability to mitigate that increase through growth in volumes. And that's a key challenge that we really have got to overcome, but we also got to manage for that reality. The second major point is the fact that we are no longer export competitive. We experienced it in our business around 2008, 2009. We had a niche export market. We were, at some point, we would argue the largest exporter of galvanized steel wire in the world. We had markets literally in the East. We had Europe, we had North America, South America, it was a major focus. From around 2008 to 2009, we could no longer make a contribution to our direct costs. There was no marginal contribution to exporting. Exporting, by the way, is in the most times is not will not contribute a net profit situation. It'll always be marginal contribution. And that's an important point in terms of some of the other points that Neva made. But we had to exit, for all intents and purposes, the export market in 2008, 2009. Why is that important? It's important because when you understand there's been no growth and in some markets shrinkage, the historic valve for excess capacity in South Africa was through exports, and it kept your unit cost down, and therefore our competitiveness was partly due to the fact that we could export excess capacity. And when there was a weaker domestic market, our exports would increase, and vice versa. We've lost that ability. Neva's pointed it out, but it's a very, very critical issue for us, specifically in the current situation where there's overcapacity. So when there's overcapacity, we really need to focus on how we manage to get exports. So moving on to the bigger pictures of policy aims. I think Neva's specific aim in terms of policy, that successive policy should be measured with regards to the reduction in costs to downstream producers. Now, let me make a big picture remark here. I think we've reflected on the fact that designation, that tariffs, their success is questionable. I think more importantly, and I'm probably going to be stepping on toes at the moment in this room. I know Neva gave us a choice between being Stalinist and Fordist, I think, at the beginning of the presentation. So I think that policy has been way too interventionist. We've had interventions in order to boost various elements that have been wide-ranging. We've had interventions on price regulation in terms of the flat steel basket, and that regulation just distorts prices. We've had regulation into raw material and inputs, and that just distorts costs. We've had intervention in terms of saving capacity with the aim of not to deindustrialize, and that just distorts supply. We've had the sponsoring of building new capacity into an oversupplied market, and that just distorts capital allocation. And now there's this suggestion that we should also intervene in prices from primary producers to downstream producers, and that's simply going to be a further distortion. And it feels a little bit like that in terms of policy. It feels a little bit like what they say from time to time about the Springbok rugby team. What they say about the Springbok rugby team is that they always have plan A and plan B, and plan A is to hit everyone hard, and plan B is simply to do plan A just harder. And I feel that some of the recommendations coming out in the presentation is just simply to do what we've been doing, but just do it harder. And I think in terms of that example of trying to regulate pricing between crude steel manufacturers and local downstream manufacturers is going to be a further distortion. The idea that you should be able to do it in some basis is not very well defined. What a normal rate of profit would be. It's going to be another set of arbitrary calculations, another set of complex administration. I think ITAC have had, and Ayabonga, I'm sure will speak to this, vast experience in suddenly becoming the market maker. In terms of the PPS system, we've had to turn on countless occasions to ITAC to actually do the deal, to literally be the arbiter between how this deal is done. And I don't think that that's a position any regulator wants to be in. So I think the same thing would happen here. It's going to deter investment. It's going to undermine market confidence. It's going to lead to inefficient distributions. It'll have all kinds of unintended consequences that price controls have. It won't be pro-growth. It's going to ignore opportunity costs, on and on and on. I think it's just a further distortion and an example of why we need a new approach that doesn't overrate the degree to which government can solve every problem. And we need to try and restore some sense that it's not necessarily for government to decide, for example, who shuts down, but we can go back to allowing markets, efficiencies, and prices to make some of these determinations rather than bureaucracy and intervention. I think the Stalinists in the room now are up in arms, but we'll come back to that, I'm sure. Having said all that, I think the argument is that we are where we are, and from an industry perspective, we do have to manage what I would hope would be a move towards the picture I've just painted. And in that respect, I think I would agree with a large part of Neva's remarks, where we do need sunset clauses on various interventions. I think in terms of tariffs, China remains a challenge for lots of different reasons, and I would be supportive in the short term of maintaining some kind of tariff arrangement there with some kind of sunset understandings. I would also think that because of the overcapacity, the only way we're going to export is with cheaper input material, and so therefore measures for producers that are temporary should be maintained or expanded. So it allows us, in the meantime, if we want to carry on maintaining capacity, to export excess. And I think that's a very important point that I'd like to expand at some point, is that, and let me do it briefly now if I have time. I've lost touch of time, so I hope that I'm
Just 2
not
minutes.
overrunning. 2 minutes. Okay. So my 2 minutes worth is that assistance in cost inputs, in the cost of inputs, whereas for Neva, it's important that then drives pricing down for the downstream. What's important for us is that it allows us to export. And I don't believe it drives the price. I think the price is driven by overcapacity and competition. In the flat market, you only have overcapacity and you don't have competition, and that's why it's not driving the price down, whereas in the long product market, it is. And therefore, it's very important at this point to maintain that valve to exports, but it should be temporary, and we should work out how that works. And finally, just to end that, I don't believe it's government who should be choosing the winners and losers on these difficult choices. They shouldn't choose which firm succeeds and which firm doesn't. And I really do think we shouldn't be afraid of building a new steel industry. I think the possibilities are out there. We can talk about it. The technologies are out there. There's a way of getting competitive in all industries based on the market size at the moment. I think that private investors would be encouraged to participate based on conditions that are more friendly towards investment. And my last remark is I think the special steel issue is over-egged. I do believe that the shortfall in special steels, if Newcastle were to close, is less than what's been out in the press. And over time, and I don't think it's a long time, I think 2 years, and in steel making terms, that's not a long time, a large portion of those special steels can be produced locally. I think I'm out of time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Oren, for sharing some of the challenges faced by the mini mills in the steel industry, and also for sharing future options moving forward. So our last speaker is Ayabonga Trawe. He is Commissioner at the International Trade Administration Commission of South Africa, also known as ITAC, and he will give us input on options for steel that ITAC has been investigating. Ayabonga, you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lesego. I hope you can hear me, and good morning to all of the participants in this dialogue. It is a pity that I can't be with you in the room, but I really look forward more than anything else to the discussions we are going to have. Because it would seem to me, Lesego, that from the two inputs we've received from me and from Oren, being straight into either a Stalinist or fold. So please bear with me because I might want to introduce maybe an Austrian or Trotskyist view on this. Why do I say this? Neva speaks about creative destruction earlier. And I think we might also want to take from Oren his metaphor about Dr. Rassi Erasmus's rugby. And I want to maybe add on that the type of baseball that is played by the English cricket team, because I think part of the discussion we should be having at a fundamental level is what do we want to become when the assumptions that gave rise to what we were no longer hold. And I think Neva has started to touch on some of these issues. And if you may, Lesego, maybe let me explain what I mean by this. Part of our problem here is, to use the rugby metaphor, we've gone through all of our moves in shadow practice, but we actually have no plan when the opponent begins to play not by the rules and the referee does nothing about it, or when they begin to play our game and we can no longer contain their game precisely because they've locked down how we are playing. If I can leave the metaphors a little bit, I think at a fundamental policy level, I unfortunately don't have the luxury, as Neva was saying, to say we are no longer in government. We are in government and at times have to make some of these decisions, but it's often helpful because also I'm not the policymaker. So Minister Tau probably has a much more difficult task in trying to navigate all of these different interests. I say this with all due respect, that often the engagements with the varying parts of the steel sector and their different technological, political economy and other interests have been akin to herding cats. So you haven't had a common vision from which all of us can pull towards. That becomes, in a sense, a lodestar, precisely because of these fundamental distinctions, but also the debris of the past we come from, of a sector that certainly had a pride of place in a siege economy, but a sector nonetheless that was characterized by varying degrees of market power. And I think Oren has spoken to this as well. But if we are to think about policy, what are some of the things we might want to think about? Well, I think the first is some of these technological choices we have to grapple with. This question of an induction or blast furnace vis-a-vis electric arc furnaces are not just the type of haggling that one might often see in the papers. They are fundamental technological questions, to Oren's latter point, that deal with many other issues. One thinker outside of the Stalinist and Fordist mode, Ernest Mandel, spoke about the characterizing feature of the latter parts or late capitalism in the 20th century was the predominance of technological rents. So we've spoken a lot today about price rents and certain margin-related rents. But if we speak on the question of special steels, it is not just an issue of blast versus electric arc furnace, as some of the EAFs in Europe show us. It is fundamentally a question about to what degree are we willing to underwrite the acquisition by as many people as possible, or many firms as possible, of some of the technological capability, accreditation, homologation, by, I might add, the buyer-driven power of many original equipment manufacturers in the automotive and in other downstream sectors, like capital equipment, for instance. So we have to make some choices here. What kind of steel sector do we want to become? Do we want to become a steel sector that is competitive in bread and butter forms of either flat or long steel, or do we want to be a sector that at least has some niche segments that it is able to produce for? Because sometimes we can't do both. Now, of course, that might be an oversimplification, much like Oren suggests the debate on special steel is creating. But if I may, it's worth considering the Zimbabwean complication introduces, even in long steel, the question of to what degree in specific products is it enough to just say in sub-Saharan Africa, you might be the dominant player. What does that mean about the demand we might be able to sell into within the region and the continent? Not from a rhetorical perspective, playing shadow practice, running through your moves and your running lines, but actually in the cold cauldron of competition in product markets. The second issue I think we need to grapple with is if you want to produce at a particular volume related to this, who are you going to sell to? And I think part of it is, yes, on the demand side, we speak a lot about the cost base. And I think we must welcome even the reflections that are coming out of government at the moment, beginning to grapple with this question of what do you do with administered prices? These are the prices where the state is a price setter. Anything from water utility charges, electricity and energy, freight and logistics, and all of these as you grapple with this question of SOC reform. It came up quite strongly in the discussions we were having in Parliament yesterday about the same issues. But if you were to listen to that, you would realize that we are not batting on the same wicket as different subsegments of the same steel sector. So at some point, what does that imply? It means certain choices are going to have to be made on technology, on the level of volume that we can justifiably say we have control of demand over. And of course, we also have to make some decisions on what share of national consumption will absorb that supply. We have to make some decisions, much like South Africa and Australia have to do as it relates to iron ore, of what do you do with your feedstock capability that feeds into steel. And then there's also the complicated question that I think Oren is raising on the export side. What must be the character of your economic diplomacy? What markets must you open up? South Africa speaks of having had historically an export market. Yes, there was competitiveness, but one of the things we do not talk about is the managed, on the part of the United States market, entry into that market through rolling quota arrangements for much of the 20th century, following the breakdown of the International Steel Agreement or International Steel Cartel in the 1920s. So this idea that we are having some kind of prospect of a breakthrough through some Javier Milei type libertarian non-intervention in the steel market does not correspond with the technological profile of this sector. Reliant as it is on scale production, on perennial and ongoing productivity improvement that no one private sector anywhere in the world, in a national sense, would have the risk appetite to underwrite. So I think let's have a fair discussion here. And part of that fair discussion is to move away from these binaries of I don't want state intervention or I want state intervention, to begin to reflect on the distribution of functions and division of labor between the private sector and the state in relation to the steel sector. Let me maybe say a few things, because I think Oren says we must play Springbok rugby. And part of the challenge of Springbok rugby is when faced with a similar competitive challenge, and we saw this in the World Cup in the game between Springboks and Ireland, where this kind of, bash, hit it up front, 2 or 3 phases, then run it out wide, was met toe to toe. And to what degree is our calculus engaging only the development of the global world market for this as something that is solely just about India and China? I find that a bit bizarre. And why I find it bizarre is we are not grappling with the development of new steel producers. Take the case of Egypt, take the case of Turkey, which on the back of some of its own policy in relation to ferrous has been able to corner certain bread and butter markets in the EU 27 market. Take the case of Egypt, which has managed to grow its crude equivalent production rapidly over time to access the same market just across the strait. What is the implication if we are debating about this as if we are in the pre-2000 era prior to the ascension of China to the WTO? So as a maybe a parting comment, I do want to say that trade in and of itself, as Neva correctly observes, is a blunt instrument. So too is unplanned designation in line with Section 20 likely to have its own unintended consequences. But at some point, all of us have to discipline ourselves to a discussion that arises from social dialogue under the master plan, which I must say at this stage is probably on life support. But at some point, difficult decisions, trade-offs, and pain and pleasure has to be part of the discussion. We're not going to be able to deal with overcapacity as a global and even a domestic phenomenon if we are not able to say, well, what informs our rationalization of this capacity? And where is it pulling towards? So if you want, for instance, growth in your downstream labor-intensive white goods sector, what is the nature of steel capability that you must have here at home as a critical part of that? What type of plate and other sheet material must you have? If you are interested, for instance, in re-establishing canning, I don't know why, maybe you might want to do that on a certain scale, but let's have the discussion. What is the nature of investment that you must have and the product diversity in specific categories of steel that you would need? And part of our problem is that we lock the discussion at an upstream to downstream without a clear integration, save maybe for the automotive sector and special steels, of this discussion. And yet we don't look at the debris of the history we come from, where a loss of a tin plate capability, for instance, foreclosed much of the space we would have had to have labor-intensive agro-processing opportunities downstream in packaging and other areas linked to our agro-industrial base. So this is a macroeconomic discussion that we need certainly to have, but in a manner that is at least disciplined by a national game plan that all of us can buy into. And if we're going to stick in our corners of either Fordist, Stalinist, Austrian, or even Trotskyist imagination without wanting to move out of it, we're probably going to be having the same discussion over the next while. Let me maybe pause there. And I hope just on particular issues that we might want to discuss, the PPS, we are busy with a review at the moment. Similarly, we are busy with a review of the steel sector, which includes the tariff schedule and import control. I would be happy to talk about that. But I thought, Lesego, let me use the 10 minutes I have to probably introduce a bit of another different binary beyond just the Stalinist and Fordist imaginary that we are having. And hopefully we can probably have a discussion that takes us somewhere, at least at the level of reflection. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very interesting take, Ayabonga. I think the hands in the room are for all three speakers, correct? Yes, thank you very much. So we'll open the floor up now for questions. So I'm going to start with questions in the room first, and then afterwards I'll take questions online. So I'll take 3 questions in the room, and then for online people, I do have some questions that have been posted in the chat, but if any of you want to unmute and ask the questions, you do have that option. Yes, we have a question from Ian in the room. Please introduce yourself, Ian. Go for it.
Thank you. My name is Ian. I'm Ian Stewart. I work here for Tips. So this has been a fascinating discussion, I think, and a much needed one. So thank you to everyone. I mean, it's great when you can talk about rugby, but also use words like calculus. I think that's very worthwhile. So my question is, what is the role? So excuse the naivety of this question, but what do mini mills do, and what is their role in steel production in South Africa today, and what could their role be in a reimagined sector or industry? And can we orient their production in national interest if necessary? Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Sutame, I think you had your hand up. Please also mention who the question is directed to, if it's directed to any particular speaker. Otherwise, we'll pose it to all 3 speakers.
Okay. My name is Sutame. I'm also from Tips. So I just have one question. I think is directed maybe to Neva and I think Ayabonga. So there's this you know, in Australia they are busy thinking of green green iron ore. So I just want to find out if whether, because Neva said that you know, iron ore is becoming less important in the green space. So I just want to understand if whether there's room for, you know, green iron ore production, for example, in South Africa, or you know, maybe there might be possible, you know, opportunities in the continent considering that you've mentioned that there are some opportunities in Zimbabwe. So maybe we might also need to expand, on some of those opportunities there.
Thanks, Utame. We also have a question from Chere.
Good morning, everyone. This is Chera from the Just Transition Labor Center. So I think this question is a cross-cutting question I wrote for everyone that what is the forecast for the impact of what Trump is doing in terms of the disruptions to global trade? For example, he's talked about tariffs on EU steel. What is the impact and what is the predictions of how this is going to interrupt the global steel industry if we are talking about what's happening with steel in South Africa? How are we factoring those? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question from the room. Steve.
Hi, my name is Steve Jardine from RSA Clusters. I think my question is, as we look at the integration of the total value chain, we realize that we need to have a lot of innovation downstream and to try and assist the SMEs to try and grow into this space over time. And our future actually lies focusing around a much wider beam than just focusing on individual nodules as we have been in the past. So I think the question really goes to this, and that is that we are still excluding several elements. So if we think about the primary environment, there was a brief mention of the factors. There's coking coal and there's other things. There's also alloying materials and so forth, which are also very important. So the question goes to maybe one second caveat, and that is that we don't have electricity or enough of it. So we're going into an environment where we've got the electricity minister saying that he wants to actually participate in the restarting of smelters. We're not talking about that at all at the moment. It's going to have a huge impact on this discussion. Secondly, in looking at primary, how do we actually make sure that we're getting the best alloying costs that we possibly can in order to make the kind of steel components that we need to? And if you look at the cost structure of many of the downstream activities, the steel cost is minimized when you start looking at all of the rest of the costs in their structures. So this is a question not only about how we actually address that, but then I think it goes to the growth factor too that was talked about earlier, because if we can actually manage these cost factors, we can start pushing the growth factors, which include our ability to export. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Neva, do you want to have the first go ahead at tackling some of the questions asked? Do you want to come here instead?
I mean, I think the one thing I would say, which also comes to the last question, but also what Oren was saying, which is the thing about the issue of pricing along the value chain, is if you say they are monopoly rents, then government has to regulate it. And that's a real problem because people say, well, it's competitive internationally, but it's a domestic monopoly. And how do you deal with that? No? So I think what we're really saying is a rent is defined as the difference between the global price and the domestic price. And generally in industrial policy, what we say, it's legitimate to regulate to ensure the rents go to support industrialization. The question is, how can you do it efficiently? And I agree with Oren. If we can't do it efficiently, we shouldn't do it. But I do think that what the regulations on scrap showed is it created a very dynamic industry. And the issue for me is more, how can we transfer those learnings to other industries? And after all, they did it for, decades before they sold off the iron ore mines. And the reason we have strong ferroalloys producers as well as Sasol now is because they own their mines. So I think that issue of that's what I would argue. Sorry, somebody's shaking their head, but I would definitely say that. Certainly the ferroalloys. Well, and Sasol, to the extent they survive at all, it's because they can get coal, even when the coal's price, more than doubled in the last couple of years, you can manage that through internal pricing if you own the mines. The problem is when you don't own the mines, is it possible for government to efficiently ensure access to cheaper iron ore for domestic producers? No? And what you also see is people like SCOR who just went off and bought an iron ore mine. So those are all possibilities that actually help. And I think we need to talk about those issues. There are ways of doing it, ideally, I would argue, by having, if the steel producers buy some of these smaller mines. That's also what they've done in Zimbabwe. Then you don't need to regulate the price. I mean, I agree with that. So the question is also how you achieve these aims is also always an interesting problem. The role of the mini mills, looking, and I don't want to, we could have a bilateral after this because it goes on forever. But the thing is, the mini mills produce basically generally lower quality long steel products. Long steel because flat steel is much harder to produce and more expensive. There is a debate about some of them really are just like melting down scrap into billets. Others are, as Oren says, producing quite high quality products and can produce most of the special steels, like 3/4 of the special steels that are now produced in Newcastle. The trouble is that last quarter is quite important for some of the downstream. They could do it, but basically the higher quality of the steel, you need higher quality inputs and you need better processing equipment downstream. All of that costs money. That's why whatever we do, if we're going to maintain special steels production, somebody's going to have to make some investments. How we do that, that's really what we're debating. And, obviously I agree with Oren. Ideally, we would level the playing field and let whoever survives come out. But, the risk with creative destruction is that given the structures are set up to support a particular producer, you end up with the opposite of what you want. No? I wasn't saying that green iron ore, actually I was talking about steel, not iron ore. But I would just argue that we tend to exaggerate the importance of steel and auto for industrialization in the modern age. And that we need to think about that because we tend to always say, let's build the big, heavy industry up to scale. Doesn't mean there's no role for those industries. We have lots of industries that are important, but the assumption that somehow that will drive industrialization the way it did in the first half of the last century is, I think, just has proven just not to be true. And I think we need to understand why that is and how that works. And be realistic about these industries rather than assuming somehow we will suddenly turn into the US in the 1920s and 30s in terms of growth. The impact of the Trump tariffs, we could obviously go on, but particularly for steel, and they just doubled them. Oh, joy. We don't export all that much steel to the US. We export some steel products. But the bigger problem is that everybody who does export to the US is now looking for new markets. And so the chances that the price of international steel trade, that those prices will come down and even further undercut, so that even though we have tariffs, you end up continuously pushing up the tariffs. And that becomes very difficult. And the price premium for local procurement in infrastructure also starts looking bigger. And all of those things become harder to manage. No?
Thank you, Neva. Oren, would you like to respond to some of the questions that were asked in the room?
Just very briefly, I think everyone's covered most of it. So just on the mini mills and what their role is, it's all about market and market size and your unit cost. We looked at that first slide of Neva's about unit cost increase in AMSA. The mini mills you can produce with an electric arc furnace, there's two kinds of mini mills in South Africa. I would call the one a micro mill. Probably require around 400,000 tons a year to produce. That's the big difference. And the micro mills someone probably on the chat could confirm probably around 100,000 tons. So therefore, it all goes down to the market size in South Africa and how we're going to serve it. Currently, the market is probably 4 million tons of consumption. I think Neva might agree with that. Split probably 1.8 long, 2 million for just over 2 million for flat. A blast furnace needs north of 1 million tons for sure to be efficient on a per ton basis. So that's one of the main differences in terms of mini mills, and therefore in a shrinking market, in a smaller market where you want competition, mini mills have a very important role to play. They bring competition at an efficient price. I think Neva covered the Trump question, so that's it for me at the moment. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Oren. Aya, any additional inputs from your side?
Yeah, no, thanks, Lesego. Just briefly, I think on the Trump issue, Neva would have highlighted the challenges, but I just want to say to Shere that our observation is there are two developments, and Neva mentioned the one, which is the whole trade diversion and trade deflection, which might mean a proliferation of product landing in South Africa below the kind of average raw material cost in some cases. But in addition to that, what we're also observing is a kind of tightening of some of the trade restrictions in key importing markets. So we've had a few discussions, for instance, with the Trade Remedies Authority during the WTO Rules Week, the Trade Remedies Authority in the United Kingdom. And one of the things they are explaining to us is that they are reviewing their safeguard measures in order to make those much more stringent in terms of the quota allocations for some of the duty-free imports of specific products, in particular some of the coil products. And so that's the other likely development, that everyone in trying to respond to trade diversion is likely to put up some barriers, and then it's a race, because the last one, I guess, to get to the point of putting up those barriers is the one who's going to be the effective outlet for some of the surplus inventory. And I think that that's a much more structural issue than just the issue of saying, well, we've got policy limitations. It's a broader issue that does require a multilateral response at a time when the multilateral system, for all intents and purposes, is failing to mount that response. And I fear that very little of that discussion factors into our own observation in South Africa of the suitable level of effective trade protection. So all of us will kind of say, well, we do need some import competition. I also believe the same. But part of it is to not argue as if all manner of protection is the same. One example yesterday in Parliament was the raising, for instance, of a safeguard measure as a particular form of protectionism in line with our industrial policy. It isn't. It's dealing with specific manifestations of unfair trade. Now, of course, does it not visit particular cost-raising effects on downstream players? Precisely. And that's where then the task of statecraft, to Neva's point, if you accept that there are particular price rents arising from monopolistic price-setting power, you do need a state to intervene for many of the other technological and scale reasons that I've mentioned earlier. The last point is on Steve's reflection. I think the point on alloying is crucial. And the point on administered prices I was making, Steve, is also super relevant to the ferroalloys sector. Part of our challenge in ferroalloys is the, how do I say it, the crucial role of the energy input costs and some of the differences between our own energy input costs and how those have grown in the last decade compared to some of the Chinese and Mongolian mills that are pumping out ferrochrome at an input base of around 50 cents a kilowatt hour compared to ours that's north of 2 Rand a kilowatt hour. And this is where then you need all of these complementary policy tools to play in song and in concert together, rather than isolating any one of them as the fundamental rents that are deserving of our scrutiny and attention. Maybe just a last one, even on the issue of scrap. I think it's interesting for me that our debate on scrap is so dislocated from the global discussion, Lesego. What about scrap is making, for instance, the United Arab Emirates place a massive export tax on it? What about scrap has made the Indian finance minister, Minister Sitaram, extend the import duty rebates on bringing scrap in while banning its export? What do those signals tell us? What about kind of the Turkish as the largest seaborne importer of scrap and some of the policy shifts there give us a sense about the availability or even short to medium term constrained supply of scrap globally? Because if we can't contend with that, then we probably also having a partial discussion. If our view, for argument's sake, is that the global scrap market is likely to be oversupplied in the medium to long term, then that must elicit a particular policy response in relation to the PPS and the export tax. I agree with colleagues, but if it's the opposite, similarly, there must be also a response so that you do not go back to the situation where you had. And this is the point I was making as I conclude. What type of sector do we want to become when all of the assumptions that enabled what we were no longer hold. I think that's very important because it also will guide how we respond to the Zimbabwean issue. And the Zimbabwean issue as one example of import competition that is coming under a new free trade area that we have got in the continent. It is not the only concern we should have. I've mentioned Egypt as well. But all of these things will inform where we think we are best placed to play with the technological know-how, the human capital, and other capability that we've built over the last century. Thanks, Lesego.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to now take questions.
Sorry, Lesego, can I just say something else? Sanjeev thinks online I'm calling for the ban of all exports on scrap. No, Sanjeev. No. I'm not calling for the ban on exports. I'm saying an assessment on the balance of evidence must inform whatever decision. Let me come to the point. If there is an expectation in the short to medium term that there will be constrained supply globally, then you need a corresponding policy response. There are degrees then, of course, of that response. Not all of it should be a ban. I certainly think we do need some kind of principled pragmatism in relation to the export of scrap. And there are certain lessons we might be able to learn, for instance, from the United Kingdom, not on Scunthorpe, but the ability to balance or fail to balance, having some primary steel production, but also being a major exporter of scrap. Prior to our measures in 2013, South Africa was the largest national source of scrap imports into India. So people want our scrap, but I'm not saying arising from that we must ban it. Certainly that's not what we are saying, just for the record. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for that point of clarity. So for the people online, if you would like to ask a question directly, please do raise your hand. Nokwanda, I have noted your hand. But now I'm going to read some of the questions that have been put into the chat box. So the first question is by Khomotso, and they're asking if there's any info or any data on the performance of SMMEs in the steel industry. We also have a question by Lisa, and her first question is, in terms of choosing winners and losers in longs, hasn't government already made a decision through the PPS and scrap policy, which has intentionally supported the mini mill industry? And then the second question is, while we export very little steel to the US, with the new 50% tariff emanating out of the US not have some kind of a direct impact on us in South Africa? I think that question was somewhat addressed. And then lastly for now, we have a question by Sanjeev. And they ask, how long will you support AMSA, whose costs are so high, not because of scrap exports alone? We'll also just take a question from Nokwanda, and then I'll hand it over to our speakers. Nokwanda, you can unmute.
All right. Okay, cool. Thanks, Lesego, and thanks to all of the speakers. I am not going to switch on my camera, so yeah, bear with me. So I've heard everyone talk. You know, I think part of the thing here is that the rugby references, the references to Stalin are only as great as, you know, the people who are listening to them can understand them. It's great. I don't understand the rugby references, but you know what I mean. And so when I listen to everyone talk, yes, you're talking about the European experience, you're talking about the Asian experience, but I haven't really had much of a sort of speaking to the South African experience. What does Ubedi say when you ask him about the implications of the movement and the steel industry? What does he say about what that has, about how that impacts his job? You know, I've heard people talk about tariffs. I've heard talking about technology, and part of the discussion I haven't really had come through is how that impacts on people's economic outcomes. What does that mean for, you know, employment? What does that mean for growth? And even with the shift towards, you know, improved technology, we know that generally technological changes often come with, you know, some employment losses. There might be some gains somewhere, but if we're looking at an already oversupplied industry that's not even competitive locally, when you look at, you know, steel from ArcelorMittal, even from the mini mills. If this industry that we have right now is oversupplied, but also we're not really making things at a globally competitive price, then should we not perhaps refocus our attention to areas where there is opportunity for employment creation, not areas where there's possibility to have conversations that we can make references to rugby about, but should we not be focusing on something else that actually gives us an industry that creates economic opportunities rather than trying to save what at this point seems to be a dying industry? And we're doing so with over incentivizing it through tariff support, through actual money, when the industry itself is no longer competitive. It's not creating enough jobs to sort of back up the amount of money we're spending on it, the amount of support that is granted. Should we not just be focusing on something different, perhaps, rather than trying to salvage this particular one?
Thanks, Nokwanda. I'm going to just take one more question from online, and it's from Hilton. They had actually posed the question, but it's a bit too long for me to read. So we're going to allow him the opportunity to unmute and ask their questions directly to our speakers. Hilton, you can unmute.
Thank you. Can you hear me there?
Yes, we can.
Thanks a lot for this very timely seminar. The question I posed, I will just give some background to it because it's necessary. It seems that we are in South Africa involved in an unseemly spat or scrap between downstream mini mills and upstream primary steel makers, and both of these sectors, without naming any companies, are fighting for short-term survival and short-term favors from government. Whereas the question of the seminar is what's the future of the steel industry? So my question that I posed, and I'll pose it and then I'll explain it, is how does South Africa use its substantial iron ore resources? We're exporting some 80 megatons per annum at the moment. To make primary steel, we will need a lot of steel over and above the scrap that we can have to build even a basic infrastructure for our population. We've got a huge backlog of basic infrastructure that you can only make out of steel. We've got a huge amount of construction to be done as we urbanize, and we need to make lots of steel. Currently, we are moving in the direction of destroying our primary steelmaking industry and moving to a position where we're going to export iron ore, export coal, and import steel. And all the value add will stay in steelmaking countries, while we in South Africa fight over the scraps of what is existing of the steel industry. So I think that is the number one question, is to recognize we're going to need lots of steel. I will take issue with Neva in her referring to the USA and Europe in the first half of the 20th century as a model for industrial and economic development driven by the steel industry, because I think what's much more relevant is the steel industry in Southeast Asia and China in the past 30 years, where we've seen it's been at the very center, both of the industrialization, the industrial and economic development, and the construction of the infrastructure, as we've seen in Southeast Asia and China, where they are actually building the homes, the railways, the transport systems, the water systems, the energy systems needed for basic infrastructure. So I would suggest that we get away from all of the scrap over the scraps, and we think about the future and how we take all that iron ore and also decarbonize at the same time, using our magnificent renewable energy, turning it into hydrogen, keeping the steel industry that we've got alive, and think about how we're going to transition to the new decarbonized steel industry, which is in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your question, Hilton. So Ayabonga, I'm going to start with you. Yeah, if there are any questions that you would like to answer. I know there are quite a few questions online, and then we'll take them in the second round of our questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lesego. If I can just pick up on the last comment, I think one is right to suggest that much of the story in the past 2 decades has been that of China, which over the last 2 decades has added kind of over 500 million tons of new capability. And if you place that into perspective, we in that period have certainly failed to breach the 10 million ton mark. So I think it's quite interesting to think about that. But a big part of what even China is reflecting on, if you look at the documents of the National Development and Reform Commission of China, is around a organized way to deal with output reduction in China. Precisely because a big part of the assumptive logic of that economic model has been that you were going to have at least some minimum demand domestically in China from the massive rollout of infrastructure, but you would also have some kind of export surplus that might arise from all manner of other investments that you're making. So if we think of the downturn in China in the context of some of these issues we are seeing in Zimbabwe and so on, that is in a way an externalization of some of the capital in order to open up and retain certain outlets for exports in a largely export-driven model. So I think I welcome that point. But I don't think it takes away from Neva's point, though, that the 1920s, if you even listen to President Trump, and even some of us here in South Africa, seems to be the nostalgic point of reference. There's this idea that we are all going to go back to what the steel works in places like Pretoria and in the Vaal and in other places used to be. And I'm saying the assumptions that held that up, let alone the existential fact of a siege economy, is no longer with us. So we need to dream different dreams, if I can say that. And I think it's linked to the question Nogwanda is raising. And Nogwanda, it's precisely for that fact that the policy shift Neva is suggesting has to be framed around some support for downstream players. I'm pushing for a pushing of that envelope to also say to those downstream players, there has to be some type of margin moderation that at least can make some of the products they make some semblance of cost competitiveness for downstream players in automotives, white goods, and in other sectors. But I want to speak on the question Lisa is raising, because I don't think in the formulation of the question that is the choice the government has made. I actually think if we take the question at face value, it complicates even this question of special steels. Lisa is saying that in longs, it seems we have made a choice by the PPS to back the minimals. Now, I want to complicate that assertion slightly. If one looks at the Automotive Production Development Program, which for that billion or so in incentives and even foregone tax revenue is by value our apex industrial policy program, Section 4.4 of the InfoDoc developed in 2021 by the Commission designates steel as one of the standard materials that are deemed as local materials originating in SACU for benefit under that program. So if I take your logic, Lisa, it would suggest to me that actually the state has done something else. The state, in creating standard materials and the sourcing of special steels by the automotive sector from what for all intents and purposes, for technological rent purposes, is the sole producer, because they are the only ones accredited by the OEMs, is an effective rent to that blast furnace in Newcastle. So when we think of the rents that have gone to mini mills, let us take it further to complicate the rents in the automotive industrial policy that have subsequently been extended to Newcastle by giving them a captive market of all of the automotive assemblers downstream in South Africa. Now, if someone might say, well, no, that's not true. Many of these same automotive players can buy from Oren. Maybe we must ask Oren, how many of these automotive players who benefit from the APDP are sourcing steel as standard materials from him or any of the other mini mills? So I think we've got to introduce some type of precision in particular to how we deal with these issues so that we don't inadvertently misinform the public in relation to the distribution of economic rents and even, I would argue, technological rents that arise from a particular integration of South African steel production into global value chains. Or else it's just as the last speaker was saying, we're going to have a scrap about scrap. And we are going to corral the entire discussion into a heroes and villains narrative that I think does a bit more to misinform than to better inform our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayabonga. Oren, over to you if you have any inputs to some of the questions that were asked. Thanks.
Here's a surprise for Lisa. And maybe a surprise for, I don't think it's a surprise for Ayabonga because we fed this information back. But right now, in the scrap market in South Africa, so Cape, arguably the biggest purchaser along with SCORE of scrap metal in South Africa. Right now, there are 3 prices for scrap in the market. There is a ITAC price, which is the PPS price, that's what everybody's talking about, the price preferential system. It's at one level. There is the export achievable price, which would be the price achieved at the scrap dealer's yard once they've paid the export tax. That's the second price. They're different. At the moment, there's about a 400 Rand difference between the two. Then there's a third price. And the third price is what we're actually buying at the moment. And what we're actually buying at is higher than both those prices. And I say this all to complicate the conversation. And I think Ayabonga would appreciate that. Let me make a second point about PPS, which is something we've struggled to communicate. Whilst it's been effective from time to time, and particularly effective when there's a shortage of scrap and the differential allows us to bring scrap up from the coast to where our mill is based in Gauteng in Vanderbilt Park. I would say that we have not bought even 10% of our scrap requirement through the PPS. Even 10%. And so the PPS has really not driven our cost structure. And we've worked and we've prepared to work and we will continue to work with ITAC to refine it and from time to time we get it right. So the answer to your question from my perspective is no, they haven't. The PPS has not been the difference between winners and losers in this case. And our third point on that is that the competitiveness or lack of competitiveness of my competitor predates the scrap tax, which has been reasonably effective, and therefore it too isn't the sole issue in terms of picking a winner and a loser. So that's in terms of Lisa's question. If I can pick up briefly on Hilton's question, and there were one or two things there that I heard. Firstly, Hilton said we need to recognize that we're going to need a lot of steel. And that just goes back to my first point of my presentation. I don't think we can assume and make policy on the basis that there's going to be a lot of steel requirement in South Africa. To make good short-term decisions and better long-term decisions, we've got to be realistic about the market size and the market growth. We've made some very poor decisions based on growth forecasts and misallocated capital on the basis of growth forecasts. And we've got to be very, very clear what that is, what that level of that market is before we get involved. But there are dreams to be dreamt, and I think Ayabonga's challenge is a good dream, and maybe we can talk about that. What a completely reimagined steel industry might look like from the production side. And I think the key issue in terms of Hilton's point is that when you look at Neva's numbers and other numbers out there, we're haunted by AMSA's struggle at the moment. It's not good for the steel industry. It's not good for South Africa. We're haunted by it. And we need good solutions. And that's not a scrap versus iron ore discussion at all. At all. We have a major issue with an inefficient producer that's creating difficult choices. And that's the issue we've got to deal with. Thank you.
Okay, so most of the questions have been answered. So yeah, most of the questions have been answered. I just want to say, look, about small business in the steel industry, the nature of the steel industry is it tends to have large economies of scale. So most of the small businesses, really small businesses, if we're talking about genuinely, like less than 20 employees kind of thing, are going to be in things like engineering and maintenance and support services. They're not going to be doing basic steel production. Theoretically, you could have a mini mill with a kiln, like with an induction oven. But, honestly, if we're talking the kind of steel we're talking about, they can produce inputs for on a serious basis. It's not going to be a small business. There are support industries for it, but that's, I think, Nakwanda's point is how do we then justify support for crude steel in particular? Downstream, you do get many smaller producers. And obviously, then you get into the retail and all of that. So if you look at the entire value chain, that's the point. The downstream is more labor intensive. But I don't think there's any part of the steel value chain that it will be as labor intensive as the services or even light manufacturing. And that's just the technology, the way the technology works. In terms of, and I agree, in terms of choosing winners and losers, I think I just want to say quickly about the PPS, which for those of you who don't know is a thing that restricts scrap exports in order to ensure that restricts the domestic price of scrap exports, basically, of scrap, so that the mini mills get cheaper inputs. I mean, my opinion would be that's the point. We want to get that kind of issue where the rents go to the downstream across the board, not just in the mini mills. So the question is, how do we reduce input? What we've been saying, how do we reduce input prices also for the integrated mills that use iron ore and coking coal? And also there's an argument about for DRI production, that's a way of processing iron ore to concentrate it, which leads to higher quality steel production in the mini mills. And also there's an export market. And we haven't really talked about it, but some people see that as a major opportunity because we do have high quality iron ore. But I'm just thinking that we need to be, the question is, again, how do we cut costs in the industry? Not how do we fight about the one measure we have that's actually worked to cut costs in the industry. With all its defects, we can always make it more efficient. I don't think it helps to say we should grow the steel value chain because there's infinite demand, infinite need. Because that's not effective demand. So just to be clear, there's many, many things we need in this world, that we don't produce because people can't pay for it. And one of our problems as a country is we cannot afford all the infrastructure we would like to have to overcome, particularly the deficits left by the past. So it doesn't help to say, look at all that need, let's invest more in steel, because if the steel, especially if our local steel is higher priced, we actually can't afford to use it for infrastructure. So I think we really need to look at this thing in terms of the economics of the market as well as our social aims. And to be clear with China, the Chinese steel industry works because they held down the prices to downstream. And that's how one of the ways they managed to push their exports internationally was by very rigorously holding down costs for the downstream. And that's why we have anti-dumping tariffs on them, because we think they're being subsidized by their government. But the other thing is that they're 18% of the world population, so they don't have a problem with economies of scale the way we do. And it's not a coincidence that the only place in the world where integrated mills are growing their share of steel production is India and China, which have the two biggest populations in the world. No? Every place else, the mini mills have been growing their share over the last 50 years. But the other thing is, we have a serious unemployment problem. 40% of our working age population is employed. International norm is 60%. So we are way behind on employment creation in this country. And one of the reasons is we've had a historic bias towards heavy industry, partially because of the emphasis on mining, but also because there was an emphasis on creating good jobs for, to be blunt, white workers, to some extent colored workers as well. And those jobs are to be seen as being in heavy industry. And so you can see it best with exports. 40% more than half of our exports are from the mining value chain compared to 20 to 30% for other upper middle income countries, even if we exclude China. And you can see the same bias toward heavy industry in employment and in the GDP and value added. Doesn't mean we should get rid of I would argue it means we should be doing more to support light industry, not that we should get rid of heavy industry. But it does mean that we have to think about, if we're using government resources, how do we really focus them in ways that will generate more opportunities for the majority of the population, rather than maintaining the same exclusive structures that were developed over, 100 years before, well, more obviously several hundred years before 1994. Top.
Thank you, Neva. So I'm going to open the floor up to the second round of questions. We only have 15 minutes for this round. So if you have questions, please keep them short. I think I'll start with online, if that's okay, and then we'll end off with questions in the room. So there were some questions online that we've received. Okay. So there's 3 questions online. The first question is by Niels, and this is directed at Oren. So Niels asks, if Cape Gate was competitive a month ago, what has happened since that has hindered their exports? And then the second question is by Isaac, and he asks, is there capacity and willingness by mini mills to invest into special steels? And then the third question that we have is from Mohammed. Mohammed, I know that you would like to ask your question directly to our speakers. You're more than welcome to unmute. Okay. I think we can stick to those 2 questions for now. I think they were directed at Oren. So Oren, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond. But if any of the other speakers would like to add their inputs, they're more than welcome to do so. Oren?
Would you mind just repeating the second question briefly?
Of course. So the second question was, is there capacity and willingness by mini mills to invest into special steels?
Okay, thank you. I'm not quite following Niels's question about us being competitive last month, but not this month. I think my point in the presentation was that we weren't competitive in a significant manner since 2008, 2009. And what has happened has been a combination of a change in the world, an opening up of other markets and other players. It's not the same world as it was, as Ayabonga has very clearly stated and correctly. And the second is just the increase in our unit costs that we can't pass on. So it's a combination of international prices and new players in the international market, and the situation I described earlier of having our input costs running way above inflation. So that, I think, are the 2 main issues for us in internationally. In terms of special steels, I think the key problem with special steels is how much special steels there are, and that goes to Ayabonga's point about niche, and do we want to have a niche? Don't we want to be a niche? We'd love to be a niche. Special steels is a difficult manufacturing challenge. It's often said of special steels, the more you make, the less you send out, because it's so difficult in quality-wise that you're often getting a massive yield loss in terms of returns or in terms of rejects. It's a difficult product, but it's doable. Certainly, we've reviewed since the last announcement from AMSA in terms of Newcastle, and the answer is yes. We believe that a vast amount, and I think Neva talked about 85% and that last 15% being difficult. I think we would be prepared in a secure investment environment to make the necessary adjustments. And those adjustments are not that complicated. And if, just to get technical for a second, it requires cleaner steel, and you do that through vacuum degassers, you do that through different stirring processes in your refining, you do that through shrouding. And these are not hugely complicated. You need a bit more precision in your rolling, which you can do. So I don't believe that the level of investment is inhibitive, and we certainly would be prepared to do it if the opportunity was there. Right now, with AMSA staying open, the opportunity doesn't seem to be there. But we are already chipping away. Let me be clear. We are already chipping away at some of those products quite successfully.
Thank you, Oren. Thank you very much for your response. So we have 10 minutes, and so I will take 2 questions and inputs from the room. Yes, we have AMSA. think they'd like to make an input.
Hi, morning. So it's not going to be a short one. I have to respectfully start by saying that the presentation made by Neva, some of the facts which are used are incorrect. It clearly lacks data, and wherever it uses data, it's just jumping from one data point to a conclusion incorrectly. And if we can put the slides up again, we can run through slide by slide, but it's massively inaccurate. To give an example, you start by saying that AMSA's costs have increased. You do not have any comparable data for any of the other parts of the industry. So just stating a fact, AMSA costs are high, and now what do? AMSA is inefficient. One does not equate to the other. But anyhow, get to the general point of things. I think it's not just on costs, but there's no other data available on the numbers. The working practices, what they pay to their employees, the safety records, all of them are compromised. We as AMSA publish results every 6 months. We are not coming back to employment. If you look at it, the value created in integrated steel mills is significantly higher than any other part of the value chain as such. And that's there in economic studies done in 2013, which was the basis of introducing PPS. There was limited intervention suggested of roughly 500 rand a ton. Today, we've made a monster out of it. And we talk about rents being sought after, etc., in some fancy language. But the reality is, what's the rent which PPS imposes on the society? It transfers about 6 to 7 billion rand a year to 10 mini mills from 500,000 scrap and waste collectors. And in the absence of this, none of the mills will be competitive. So that's the question which we are unwilling to discuss. And we want to decide the future policy in South Africa. If we want to talk about jobs, yes, steel is not that important anymore. It's still one of the best paying jobs in the society. The industry, upstream and downstream, the wages are about 3 times that of construction, 2 times that of automotive. So every job is worth a lot more than most other parts of the society. This despite having whatever 40% unemployment. We refer to things as being green just by melting scrap. 2/3 of the world steel production, not now, in 2050, will still be produced through iron ore. DRI as a savior is only 100 million tons out of almost 2 billion tons. So only 5% of the world's steel is produced through DRI. When you want to call DRI green, you need to reduce it through gas or some other greener thing. Just by burning coal and producing DRI is not the path to greening it. So there's technological fallacies which are being peddled as future panacea. People have addressed that there's sufficient iron ore in the country. How do we use it as a competitive advantage to utilize the latent capacity in the country, which is blast furnaces, arc furnaces, or induction? Capacity is created. It's not going to go away. So how do we use it efficiently to serve what can be an industrial goal to have some form of job creation? Beyond that, I think we should not live in an island. When the whole world decides to become localized and protectionist, we want to stay open and let everybody in. We can wish that, today manufacturing jobs are not so important, but that's the only jobs we have. We can switch off manufacturing. Similarly, we can switch off agriculture. Similarly, we can switch off automotive. Everything is uncompetitive for us because we want to import from China. So those are the few things. On unit cost basis, I think if we put a normalized description of costs, it will become fairly clear that take out the costs which are external, and blast furnaces are still the most efficient route of production within South Africa. I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, good.
Thank you so much.
I'm available if somebody would like to have a detailed discussion with actual data, not wishy-washy thought process.
Thank you for your input. I know we only have 5 more minutes. I want to take one more question from the room. One more question. Any burning questions from anyone in the room? Nothing.
There's one online.
Oh, there's one online. Okay, cool. Niels, we'll take the final question from you. And then I'm going to ask our speakers to give their final remarks and any additional takeaways while responding to your question and maybe also responding to some of the input that we've heard by AMSA. Thank you. Sorry, so each speaker will have at least a minute. Niels, please make the question short. Thank you.
Yes, you just missed the statement above the question. About 13 May, Mr. Kaplan said, press release, so before AMSA state bailout, our market share was not being maintained by virtue of a distorted cost of scrap. We were competitive on an international basis. So that was about a month ago, the state bailout. If Cape Gate was competitive a month ago on an international basis, why is it a problem to export today? Why are they not exporting much more then? Thank you.
Thanks, Niels. Oren, I'm going to give you a chance to respond and also to close, please. Thank you.
Very quickly, we're competitive in South Africa. In other words, we are selling in South Africa below import parity price. That's been the case for a long time. And so we've been competitive on that basis. Without protection, and it's not due to the PPS, and we haven't got time to go into that, but that's exactly what that was intended to mean. It wasn't to do with exports. I don't think there's anything else at this point. I think we're running out of time. We've got 2 minutes to go. I just think it's important on the last speaker to say one fact that was left out in terms of AMSA's position is whether there's a market for that capacity, and I would contend that there isn't, and that's the fundamental issue. And so it just remains for me to thank you, Lesego, and everybody at TIPS. Really do appreciate the opportunity to engage and to talk and to hear and to listen to others. There's a lot more we can say and do, and I hope there'll be further opportunities for similar engagements. And thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Oren. Ayabonga, over to you. You have a minute for any additional remarks to conclude or answer any questions or respond to AMSA.
Thank you, Lesego. I have no particular responses. Suffice to say, I hope certainly those who sit outside the industry have seen the nature this debate takes on and the limits and complications to why it is so difficult to get to a minimum dream that all of us can feel that we can collectively dream as a country. I'd said earlier on, often engaging the sector seems like herding cats precisely because of these areas of divergence. And I think to a varying degree, we've seen it on display today. It's not unique here. You see it between kind of the sort of coal interest vis-a-vis the green interests. And even that might be too simplistic a characterization. But even in that debate, often the perspective in policy terms is that of energy. And certainly my own humble understanding of our own policy posture as a country is that we take no particular technological fancy, if I can say that. Which is why, even if you look at the investment profile of IDC, someone asked that earlier. Now, IDC can speak for themselves, but I can tell you that IDC invests in both technological platforms. So I think we must avoid the saints, sinners, pious versus atheist type discussion when we approach what type of steel sector we want. Or else we're going to get hobbled on my costs are better than yours. I'm more competitive than you are. Or a binary that says state intervention versus state intervention. The world is much more complex than that. And I certainly hope that the more we discuss Lesego, the more we find time to put our views across, we might get to some conflict.
Oh no, okay, so we've lost Ayabonga. Neva, I'm going to give you a minute. to wrap up and conclude, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to thank everybody for their inputs. I think this is an important kind of discourse to have. I do think that the input from AMSA shows why it's so hard to have a reasoned discourse sometimes. I think what is important, what we're trying to do is say, if we agree on the outcomes we need from the value chain, then we can talk about how do we collaborate to get there. And it doesn't help just to trash the competition at that point. Rather, we have to say what is best for the country. And the one thing I would say is, except he may or may not be able to hear me, is core for any industrial strategy is you need to be competitive. You can't just do it all through subsidies and tariffs and designations and protection. In the long run, we can only have a successful industry if we can bring down our costs. And I mean, the reason we focused on Newcastle costs, I know you didn't like it, but the fact is, on AMSA costs, is because it is the closure at Newcastle that is threatening, that is why people suddenly wake up to that fact there is a crisis in the industry, I think. And that we're basically arguing, and that this is where we could debate, that increase in unit costs, which comes from your own annual reports, is actually a core problem. As Oren says, at the moment, the mini mills are not complaining about excessive costs. They're managing to get by. But I do think what's more important is that we need to have an industrial policy which is based on saying, how do we get to more competitive production in the established industries? It's also possible that there are some places where we're creating jobs on a mass scale where we might say we could relax that requirement. But the steel industry is not ever going to create jobs on a mass scale. We can debate about how important it is to have high quality jobs when you have mass unemployment. No? I don't think anybody wants substandard jobs, and I used to work for COSATU, so I do know these debates. But I don't think we should have to say, because there's some of the best jobs in the country, we have to protect them forever. Yeah, and then one last point, just because it's important. The scrap that is used in the mini mills is not coming from, the scrap collectors you see on the street. They get very little of their income. There's been surveys on this, actually, from metals collection. Most of that scrap comes from Transnet and other people who use steel in the production process. There is an argument that we should not be moving rents from them to the mini mills. That argument does make some sense, and we can talk about it. But I don't think we should be seeing this thing about scrap as exploiting, the guy on the street with the trolley, because they're actually not involved in a big way in supplying metal to the mini mills. But again, I just want to thank everybody, and I hope we can have more of these kinds of debates and really try and think about what are we trying to do with industrial policy in the steel value chain.
Thank you very much for the people online and also for the people in the room for attending and also for the engaging conversations. Thank you very, very much to our speakers as well for the interesting debates and also the insights that they shared on the future of the steel industry in South Africa. Yeah, I think we can close. Thank you, everyone. I think lunch is available for the people in the room. Thanks.